We're here with H. Stuart Elway, one of America's most respected political pollsters, and his dad, Harry S. Elway Jr. of Hoquiam, was in this house for, when was Harry first elected?
52, and he was served in 53, 3 terms here and then a term in the Senate. So he's 10 years in the legislature.
I love your stories about what it was like to come up here with your mom to visit your dad. Tell us about that, what it was like.
I spent a lot of time in this room from the time I was about 5 years old. I'd come up and be a honorary page. And they let me sit in with the pages.
How old were you then?
Well, 5, 6, 7, right in there.
Wow.
And in those days, the legislators would stay in town. So my dad had a house, lived in a rented house here with a bunch of Democrats, which would never happen anymore.
No.
And my grandmother would be my mom would be up here some of the time, and so I can remember my grandmother putting me in my little suit and putting me on the bus in Aberdeen, and my mom picking me up here and coming to the state capitol. And it wasn't, there's no TVW then, of course, and so the cameras were all stationed up in the corners there, and they'd roll some tape, and my dad would call me to be the page and hand a note and send a note up to some senator that was in another chamber. Send her up in the front row and says, "Thanks for getting my son on television." That's all the note said.
I absolutely love it. So when after, let's see, you graduated from the University of Washington in 70?
Yes.
And so then do you arrive here as an aide to Governor Evans at that time?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, the summer before I'd been down and worked as an intern, and then the summer of 70 started out as a we were in the Commission for Youth Involvement.
The Commission for
Yes,
Youth Involvement.
yes, indeed. Jim Waldo was the director, and I was his assistant in the year in '69, and then '70 came down and worked in the governor's office as a summer intern, and persuaded him to keep me around, and I stayed for 2 years.
So what did you get to do that first year? What as a young gubernatorial assistant, what was your MO? What were you supposed to do?
Well, a lot of it was constituent relations, they would call now. A lot of correspondence comes through, and
there were letters back then.
These things called letters. There were words
Stamps.
on paper, yeah. And each morning I'd have a stack, and with a note on it from Jim Dolliver, who was the chief of staff, said, "See me." And so I'd have my letter, my stack of things. I'd go in, and he'd say, "Well, this is what we do with that one, this is what we do with that one," and then I would go off and write responses or follow the question that was asked or something like that. Later on, after I graduated from summer intern to a staff member. In those days, there were only 23 people in the governor's office, including clerical staff. So it was a much smaller operation. But one of the highlights for me was every 2 weeks I would go over to Spokane and be the governor's representative in Spokane.
How old were you then?
Well, that was that same period. So.
23, 24?
Yeah, right. And Sam Reed's mother ran the office in the Lincoln Building in Spokane.
What was her name?
No,
she was an amazing lady.
Yeah, just blanking.
I want to say Jerry.
It's Jerry.
Yeah, Jerry. How about that?
Don't show that tape to Sam that I didn't remember his name. So, excuse me. So she actually put an ad in the paper that the governor's representative was coming, and people would make appointments, and then I'd go in there, and sometimes I'd fly over in the State Patrol plane. I mean, this was heady wine for a 21-year-old kid, and wear my beads.
You wore your beads?
I had longer hair then, and I'd show up in the Spokane office, and these people would come in, and they'd look at me, and we.
Youth must be served.
Yes, yeah, and. I'd make a call to the Labor and Industries Department or something and say, "I've got, Joe Smith here, and can we help him out?" And so that kind of stuff. That was good stuff.
You got to work for in my judgment as a historian, two of the most remarkable figures in Washington State history. Our three-term governor, future United States Senator, President of the Evergreen State College, Daniel J. Evans, and his chief of staff, his dear friend, who went on to become Chief Justice of the Washington Supreme Court. I mean, James Dolliver.
Yeah.
When you think back 50 years, first it's hard to believe it's been 50 years.
Well, it really hasn't. It couldn't be. It's not possible.
Yeah. Is there something that really resonates with you from that? Well, we could think back to 1968 in the so-called Action for Washington campaign,
right?
Involving Dan Evans running for re-election, Lud Kramer, the Secretary of State, running for re-election, Slade Gorton, a state representative, running for Attorney General, and Arthur Fletcher, Pasco City Councilman, running for Lieutenant Governor.
Right.
And my recollection is that you started out that was going to be a bipartisan kind of group of young people, but it coalesced around those mainstream Rockefeller Republicans, didn't it?
Yeah, yes it did. And it really brought together, there were some separate organizations. I started out as chairman of Collegians for Evans at Grays Harbor College, but they merged all those, and then when Art Fletcher came in, it became this action team. And the four of those guys really inspired people. And Action for Washington was a remarkable thing, and Sam Reed and Chris Bailey put that together and deserve the credit for organizing that. But we ended up with 3,000, 4,000 high school and college people around the state working for these four candidates.
And you staged some sort of doorbell blitzes.
Well, yeah, that was our big deal. We would converge on a town. We do a lot of doorbelling, but we looked at Centralia and Chehalis, and said, well, this is laid out real well. We were looking at the maps.
Sure.
So we had an evening where we would come with, some of us came down from I was working in the Seattle office by then, came down, and then people would come from Aberdeen and Kelso and Centralia and up from Vancouver, and we had, as I remember it now, we had about 200 people.
Oh, easy.
And we doorbelled the entire town in one night. And then we had a big rally at Fort Borse Park, and Fletcher spoke and lit us all on fire, and we went out and found another town to go and do.
When you think back, Arthur Fletcher is this former collegiate star football player, played briefly in the pros, didn't have a career there because of wartime injuries. But I covered that campaign in '68, and here was this big, charismatic African-American, or Negro in the parlance of the era. I remember I talked to Art on that campaign trail and told him that he was moving up in the world. Before that, he'd always been referred to as the Negro Pasco City Councilman.
Yeah.
And then one day the Seattle Times referred to him as inarticulate Negro.
Oh yeah, that's great.
And Art just roared and said that, and we're very musical and we have shiny white teeth.
Right.
And I thought that was the most wonderful line. But do you think that if Art had been elected lieutenant governor with his charisma and moxie, that he could have been back in that era, broken through that racial barrier and gone higher?
I do. I mean, he was charismatic. Hardly even begins to describe this guy. He was so magnetic and so. Just to hear him talk, you wanted to go out and run through walls. And I think that he could have really changed the course of Washington State history and maybe national. And he went on to do great things nationally, but I mean, he not out of the question at all. He could have been a United States Senator from here or governor later on, and it would have changed a lot of things, I think. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Stu. We
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.
All right, thanks.